Hello everybody and welcome to the next Soundcastle Book Club. My name's Hannah Dunster, I'm one of your hosts here at Soundcastle, and our book club is all about connecting the fantastic research that's out there that exists in the community music world, and we connect it back to the reality of what we do on the ground. And if you're watching as part of the live communal showing, if you look up to the right of the screen, you'll see that there's a live chat. Please feel free to get involved, leave your thoughts and comments, ask questions, and know that we're a community of practice. We're all at different stages of our career, so every voice is welcome. And I'm delighted to have the wonderful Naomi Kayayan with us today. Hello, Naomi.
Hi, Hannah.
Wonderful to have you with us. Naomi is a fantastic pianist, teacher and researcher. Naomi, would you like to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. So as you said, I'm a pianist, and a lot of what I do is teaching and researching. I have a portfolio career, which is like most musicians. And I'm just starting actually a PhD at the moment, which is very broadly looking at different kinds of pedagogy, mostly in conservatoire teaching and in higher education. That's the area that I'm really interested in, and particularly looking at different kinds of pedagogies and what those pedagogies really mean in practice. So I'm doing lots of reading and lots of literature searches at the moment, and one of those books that I've actually come across recently is what we're going to be looking at today. So I'm really excited to have a chat about it with you and to talk a little bit more about some of the concepts.
Brilliant. I was so pleased you brought this book to me. So this book is The Power of Partnerships, and it's by or edited by Lucy Mercer-Mapstone and Sophia Abbot. I thought this was a brilliant book, Naomi, because you are such a good person for finding the more accessible texts that are out there. So can you just give us a brief introduction to the book itself?
Yes, absolutely. So it was quite a fortuitous meeting actually between me and this book, because it's something I've come across very, very recently, literally by accident, as I was doing a literature search on partnership. And something that is very current at the moment in a lot of educational research is the concept of engaging students as partners in teaching and learning. There's a lady called Cathy Boville at Edinburgh University who's doing quite a lot of work on this at the moment. But as far as I see, there isn't very much of that happening in music education. So enter my research really at the moment is what I'm looking at, and it's something that I'm hoping to find out more about. So, excuse me. So when I came across this book, and particularly this chapter 7 that we're going to be looking at today, I was really encouraged to read what other people are saying about partnerships and how effective they are, and thinking more about how we can incorporate some of that partnership work in music education particularly. So this book is actually a collection of several chapters, and the editors have brought together 51 authors from different parts of the globe. Some of them are professors at universities, some of them are students. So there's a real sense of bringing together lots of different voices. And as I'm going through this book, it's still something I'm journeying through. What I'm finding is that these collective voices are really sort of ringing together, and there's so many collective themes that are coming through, which I think are really, really important. So I'm quite excited by what I'm learning from it. And this particular chapter, I think, resonated with both of us. So yeah, I'm really pleased to be looking at it in a bit more detail today.
Brilliant. Shall we dive in then?
Yes, please, let's do.
Let's do it. So we are looking at chapter 7 today, the experience of partnerships in learning and teaching. And this is by Kelly E. Matthews, who's an associate professor from the University of Queensland, Australia. And the first quote we've extracted to take a look at goes as follows. Engaging in learner-teacher partnerships in hierarchical educational structures is messy work, fundamentally about human relationships in a particular socio-cultural context. Power and identity always come into the story of pedagogical partnerships. It is a way of thinking, being, and relating in higher education as human beings who care about other human beings. Now, I love this because although this chapter is really thinking about higher education, I think we can connect it back to so many community music contexts we work in, so many teaching contexts we work in. And I was wondering, Naomi, could we start off by thinking about this nature of hierarchy and the impact that that has on teacher, student, or facilitator community partnerships and relationships.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's such a really interesting idea, this sense that a hierarchy can frame a teaching and learning environment, be that a one-to-one lesson, be that in a community music setting, a classroom, or what have you. So I think you're absolutely right. It's definitely applicable to so many different areas of teaching and learning. And I think that is, for me, something that is quite confusing, because when I think about teacher student, teaching and learning, you know, we talk about these words as though they're separate things. And for me, in my discoveries and my quest to understand these ideas better, what I'm finding more is that it's almost two sides of the same coin. It's something that's moving in and out, and that's changing shape all the time in a way that is quite messy. That's the word that the author uses quite a lot. So I think when there is a hierarchy, and when we think I am the teacher and this is the student and I have the knowledge and I'm transmitting this in, you know, almost I can see an arrow pointing in one direction, then I think that does have an implication for, as you know, the author says, about power relationships, and then that has a knock-on effect on content, and it has a knock-on effect on the quality of learning and how the learning actually takes shape.
You're right. Yeah, I always think as soon as we have I am the expert fountain of all knowledge and I am the vessel that will absorb this knowledge, I think it puts a huge amount of pressure on both parties. And I find that any situation where I feel like I need to be the expert and have all the answers can be really anxiety inducing. And actually, if we start to see the more messiness of the relationship, the ebb and flow, the push and pull, you start to think, well, actually, we're all responsible for the learning in this situation, or in community music contexts, we're all responsible for the creating. I definitely had an interesting experience of this when I first got involved in community music, because I just had my experience of education, which was kind of like, oh, they're the expert and I'll learn. There's not a huge amount of training out there in community music, and if we don't try and break cycles, it's so easy to just replicate what we've the type of education that we've received. I don't know if you feel the same way about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a lot of there's a lot of this being written in the literature and in research about teachers teaching as they were taught, and something that I stumble upon quite a lot is this, you know, somebody who might have done teacher training and then the next day they're a teacher. You know, what does that mean? How do you go from being a learner one day to this so-called expert the next? And what does expertise even mean? And who has that expertise in the room? Does the student have the expertise? Does the teacher have expertise? So all these words, I think, really needs a little bit more clarification. And I think a lot of it depends on the individual's own definition of what those words mean as to how they kind of approach this, really. So it's different for different people. And what I find, and I think a message that comes through very strongly in this book, actually, is that you could be having a conversation with a colleague or another professional using the same language, but actually meaning very, very different things. And so that, I think, again, just adds another layer of, well, potentially confusion, but actually also excitement, really, because, you know, there's more to discover and more to understand about it, I think.
Yeah, I love the fact that you mentioned there that we're often interpreting language differently. And so we think we're talking about the same thing, but actually we're not. And that, for me, feeds once again into the messiness of human relationships. And we can't expect that if we follow this lesson plan to the letter, everything's going to work out perfectly. I often find I can deliver the same activity, but two people in the community group that I'm working with will have completely opposite reactions to that activity, whether it brings out a real creative drive in them or whether it leaves them completely cold. And it's messy. And so everything has to be in this constant state of responsiveness and dialogue and communication, essentially, to understand the creating, the learning process.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of that is based on intuition and being able to, well, one, be open to change and for things to happen that you weren't expecting. And that's, I think, sometimes the danger of planning and teaching. And planning is important, of course, but sometimes, if one becomes too ingrained in that plan, and then when something different happens, it can often throw off balance a little bit. So expect the unexpected. For me, that's what I think messiness it is, really. It's being open to absolutely anything could happen in this room. And that's the joy of it, really, and being ready to engage with that, and to learn from it and create new dialogues and create new learning experiences within those partnerships. And that's the exciting thing, isn't it? Because you never know quite what's going to happen.
Yeah, beautiful. I think that leads us really nicely onto the next point, actually, from this chapter. So what she says, what I am currently appreciating about the whole partnership thing is that it is messing with what we do in higher education. By messing with what we do, the idea, the language itself, is creating space to think together. Importantly, this space includes a group of people, students, typically excluded from the learning and teaching conversations that carry the weight of making decisions, guiding action, and shaping policy. I thought this was really important because it goes beyond what's happening in the room itself to the whole planning, logistical infrastructure of everything. And once again, although this is talking higher education, this absolutely applies to community music as well. I've noticed, if in community music, if we try to parachute in to a community with no consultation about what that community actually wants to be doing, the project will always be a flop because you're just making assumptions about the people you're working with. For me, one of the most important stages is the consultation, the building of the initial partnership, what we can exchange together. And this idea of exchange is really fundamental to it. I don't know if you have similar experiences in your teaching.
Very much. As I'm listening to you speak about this, there are so many different concepts kind of flashing across my brain at the moment. I'm thinking, oh yes, it connects with so much. I think there's something to say about sort of historical values about teaching and learning, to separate them in that way, which I often don't like to do, but for now I think we understand what those terms are. I think this is the true for students and for teachers and for parents and other people who are part of the wider community of who's involved in teaching and learning, because I think there's a path along which we understand teachers as to be the people who, as you said before, are the experts who have this knowledge. And so I think sometimes students kind of assume a certain role which they can naturally fall into. And, particularly in higher education, but in any setting really, they're waiting to receive, what am I going to be taught today? And, the other side of that is the teacher is waiting to deliver, what am I going to teach today? That again goes back to this idea of hierarchy. The teacher is here and the student is there. And so what would a picture look like that brings those things together or turns that shape upside down on its head? These are things that I'm really interested in looking at, and I think this chapter particularly delves into that. And there was something else you were mentioning about this idea that of the student coming with different stories, and us not kind of assuming things and wanting to know a little bit more about what's brought them to a particular setting. So, we can assume quite a lot, I think, sometimes, particularly in a situation that we're unfamiliar with, or if it's a new class or something like that, new student. So taking the time to get to know the other people in the room, it sounds really, really obvious, but it's so vital, because then as soon as you start developing that relationship, you can start building trust. And once you start building trust, then other things can happen.
That's it, Naomi. And I think you say it sounds obvious, but actually I think if the partnership building hasn't taken place, you can fall into the trap of me and them, teacher and students, or facilitator and community members. That's when the divide starts to occur. That's when stress can start to occur, because you feel on your own and you feel on different sides of something. If the partnership starts to be built, then you're far more likely to see the group of people as a group of individuals, you're less likely to make assumptions about them. You're more likely to understand that they've each arrived with a very different story to that place, and they're each going to interact differently. And I really think that grows out of the partnership itself. I think that's a really fundamental side of it. And for me, that ties in directly with well-being as well, feeling that not everything is on your shoulders, but it's a communal responsibility.
Yes.
The creative process, the learning process, it's something communal that's going to happen together, and everyone needs to make a decision to step into it. And the point that you made as well about sometimes students arriving with an assumption that they're going to receive, I've encountered that in community projects as well, where it's like, oh, but you're the expert musician, so you just tell us what to do. And that you almost have to break these societal expectations that are ingrained in all of us from our initial educations. And I find often at the beginning of a community music project, we need to like play games and get a bit silly and literally just break out of that mold and re-establish what these kind of social relationships are going to look like.
I think as well, it's for the role of the teacher or facilitator, or however you're going to describe, that person in the room. I think this is kind of, again, you say pressure and responsibility to be the perfect person in the room. I think something interesting is what happens when, if you're demonstrating something, if you make a mistake, what response do you get back from the other people in the room? How do they receive that? And I think, and that's interesting as well. So I think, we as educators, teachers, facilitators, you say have this weight of responsibility on our shoulders as being the ones who are delivering all the time. And sometimes, it's interesting maybe to think about where that expectation comes from. Does that come from us within? Does it come from external sources? Does it come from the students themselves? So I don't think there's one answer to that. I think there are several different contributors to that situation being as it is. But I absolutely agree, breaking down those boundaries early on and playing with roles and, mixing it up, that is going to create a very different environment on which to base new relationships and build foundations. So yeah, I absolutely agree.
One of my favourite stories of this that you've just made me remember is with a family music project that Soundcastle runs called Musical Beacons. And we had a 2-year-old toddler leading an entire group of probably about 20 different people, all made up of different ages, parents, family members, other toddlers. And this one little toddler was like leading everyone in this huge, big improvised jam. And I just thought, that's all coming from that little person there who is exercising their facilitation skills in that moment. And I had this realization of, oh, I'm sharing the responsibility with this toddler in the room here, and that feels amazing.
Yeah, that's a lovely story. That reminds me actually of another slightly similar. It was an experiment. It was when I was at school, actually. It was years and years and years ago. And headmistress at my school decided she was going to play a trick, and she put on some cleaners' overalls and got the mop out and the bucket out on the day that all the parents were arriving for this big open day at the school. And she wanted to see if it made people treat her differently. And it's different, but there's something similar in that, because I think, again, it comes into these sort of stereotypes, these hierarchies, what society thinks an educator looks like or behaves like, or what sort of knowledge they have. So a lot of it is, how you dress it up, really. And even in community settings, and I wouldn't describe myself necessarily as being a professional community musician, but I have dabbled in these things and worked a lot in schools with different age groups. There's always somebody in the room who's sort of in charge, who's leading this session, however you want to describe that. And, people can often come in, it can be quite flexible, and they're sort of looking around, who is it that I need to go and speak to sign in, or to say, yes, I'm here today. And, sometimes in settings, it's quite hard to identify who that person is. And at other times, exactly who it is. And it's these sort of almost invisible things that are there that nobody really can quite identify, but they're sort of still there. Yeah. And perhaps even in an informal way, and then looking at it in more formal settings, maybe in conservatoires, maybe in higher education, or what have you, those structures become a little bit more solid. And we're all sort of easily able to kind of hinge upon. And we see these things, and I think it does affect kind of the cultures of learning and the subcultures and the environment that people are creating in. So I just, everything you say, I think it's absolutely valid, and it's a really interesting topic. I think that needs a lot more further exploration.
Yeah, and it's almost as if everybody needs to unpick it in their individual environment and think, okay, so what are things looking like here? Is there hierarchy? Is it possible to break it? Is it possible to be more collaborative? And I think this brings us round to the last point to kind of round up our conversation today. And I love this. So she finishes the chapter by saying, thinking differently about partnership as more than words, as art, can open up different forms of dialogue. This particular visual metaphor, and I should say she shares a beautiful piece of art in the chapter, which I'll show. This particular visual metaphor is about the messiness of human relationships that for me at the moment define how I am making sense of pedagogical partnership. An image, I contend, that offers space to affirm the messiness of an idea, an aspiration, a practice, a pedagogical praxis, and a commitment. And so I'm just going to show the visual metaphor now. So it should be up on the screen now. And you'll see that she's put this incredible image full of all these lines and brush strokes. And this is how she's talking about partnership. Like, look at it as a piece of art, as more than words. And I'd just like to explore this with you, Naomi, in terms of this messy kind of happy chaos that can come with partnerships, and what your personal experience of working in partnerships is.
Well, just to say something about the picture that you're describing, there isn't, I don't know very much about art. I'm not an art expert, but when I look at it, the thing that strikes me straight away is that it has very little definition to it. You can't look at it and say, that's a picture of a house or a building or a vase. You can't tell quite what it is. And it's full of different colours and everything's moving in different directions. And I think those themes that are coming across, for me at least anyway, really represent what can happen in partnerships. Because you can start off with an idea, you can start off with a set of criteria, if you like, about what you want to do, what your aims and objectives are, what you're trying to set out to achieve. And then by the end of it, you can look back and think, well, that's not at all what happened. And some people might look back and say, well, then that wasn't very effective. I argue that that's not necessarily the case. Again, it's all contextual. Everything is context-based, isn't it? But sometimes the best discoveries can be made from these sorts of partnerships, which are, as she describes, messy. And again, I think one needs to understand what messy is. Again, it's different to different people. Sorry, you were about to say.
No, sorry, I'm interrupting you because I'm getting excited. I think it's because ultimately we can't control other individuals around us. We can't control the direction of the relationship. And if that picture was made by two people together, you never quite know where their next brushstroke is going to land. You can anticipate it, you can think you're aware of the direction, but they are their own individual and they're going to be following their instincts as well. And so you have to sort of be ready to be like, yes, and I'm going to follow you here, and now come on, let's have a look over here, and hope that as long as you have a kind of shared vision, you'll find your way there together. And different people like to establish the nature of their partnership and what they might need from each other and their expectations within that. And I think that's really, really important, but to also know that ultimately you can never control what that outcome might be.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's human nature. As you were describing this scenario with one person kind of leading and then another moving with their movements, it just reminded me of a group improvisation, where there might be a sort of a small theme or something, but then one person plays and then another person interacts with something different, and you don't know how it's going to pan out. And that's the beauty of it. Because the creation is happening in real time, and it's happening all the time, and it depends, the success of it depends on the group. It doesn't depend on one person, or one person having the knowledge, or one person being a better player than the other, or whatever. It doesn't, none of that matters. What's happening is this thing is being created, it's evolving in real time. And I think that there is something sort of parallel in sort of teaching and learning exchanges and settings. There are a lot of similarities there, I think.
Yeah, I love that. And I love from what you're saying there, it's this idea the partnership isn't just between facilitator and community member, or teacher and student. It's between the students themselves, it's between the community members themselves. So there's multiple partnerships happening across one room at any given time. Beautiful. So Naomi, we're coming to the end now, but I really want to ask the people watching this the final question of the chapter. And you and I have been talking about this a little bit, about how partnerships feel messy. And I just want to put that question out there to everybody watching. How is your partnership messy? And just take a moment to think about that, consider that for your working life, for the elements that you're engaging in right now. How is your partnership messy? And what beauty can you pull out of that? Naomi, thank you so much for joining us for Book Club.
Thank you, Hannah. It's been brilliant having this chat with you. It's such an exciting topic, and I'm looking forward to exploring it even more still.
I know, it's one we could talk for hours about. Condensing it into 25 minutes is hard enough.
Absolutely.
And for everyone watching, please do come and join us over on the Soundcastle community. We'll keep a thread going under this video there, so if you weren't able to join us for the communal viewing and the live chat, you can share your thoughts over there on the community. And we'll be back with Book Club in a couple of weeks' time. Until then, thank you so much again, Naomi.
Thanks, Hannah.
Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.